Can science explain everything?
Well, if you ask whether science can explain everything, then first of all you have to ask, well, which science do you mean? And if you identify science with one particular natural science, then certainly it cannot explain everything, because, for example, biology cannot explain everything that the chemist or the physicist or the medical researcher can explain. If you mean by science all the empirical natural sciences like chemistry, physics, medical research, biology, genetics, and so on, then if you put them all together, they certainly cannot explain everything, because there are fields of other disciplines which are not, in that sense, natural sciences. So, for example, mathematics and mathematical laws are not explained by these empirical sciences. So then if you say, well, also I count mathematics under these sciences, and computer sciences and programming and all of that, and do all of these sciences put together, can they explain everything? Then I would say certainly not, because there are sciences such as humanistic sciences, or philosophy, psychology, literary studies, art, which explain many things which all these sciences put together cannot explain. And if you ask, well, can philosophy, literary science, and all natural sciences all put together explain everything, then I would say not, because there are many questions, for example, religious questions, like whether God became man or redeemed us, or the question whether God is one single person as Judaism or Islam believe, or a trinity of persons, and that answer to those questions cannot come from all these sciences put together, including philosophy, but they are theological or religious questions. So I think, and if you then ask, well, if you count even theology plus philosophy plus mathematics plus all natural sciences, put them all together, can they explain everything? Then I would say certainly not, because in each of these fields, the scientists who are competent to answer the questions that arise in that field, countless questions are unanswerable by the scientists or by philosophers. Philosophical questions, many are unanswered by philosophers, and theologians don't comprehend all that is to know about God. So I would say human knowledge is limited, and even all sciences of man put together cannot explain everything, but only some things. And if they explain the things they can explain and do not pretend explanations which are false, then we are already in good shape. And we know a lot, but we know also the limits of what we know. And above all, the scientists, the natural scientists, understand that there are many questions regarding their own area of investigation, for example, evolution, which they cannot answer by means of their methods, but where they need the help of some others, like philosophers.
Philosophy and evolution.
Well, there are many aspects of the theory of evolution which of course are scientific hypotheses or have to be argued for or against it by means of the methods of natural science. But there are many questions that regard philosophy. First of all, the ultimate and first cause of the genesis of the universe, the origin of the universe, which involves also the question of whether or not God exists, whether matter could produce the whole universe. And that's a purely philosophical, metaphysical question on which natural science by its essence cannot say anything with its empirical methods. Or the question of whether the spirit of man, the soul of man, is distinct from the body and therefore can never be explained in terms of evolution. Or even the question, what is the nature of evolution? What do we mean by that term really? Do we perhaps mean entirely different things when we say evolution? And these conceptual analysis of the meaning of the term evolution also is a philosophical task. So I think the problem of evolution has as much to do with philosophy as it has to do with natural science and biology.
How does evolution impact on our knowledge of man?
Well, if you ask how does evolution impact on our knowledge of man, we of course assume that evolution is a fact, because otherwise it would impact on our wrong conceptions of man rather than of our knowledge of man. But I think, and I do think, that the theory of evolution, at least in its Darwinian and neo-Darwinian sense, in its atheistic and materialistic form, is does not enhance our knowledge of man, but rather our great erroneous conceptions regarding man, believing that man is just a product of some processes and developments of beings below the person, like animals or plants, or even matter and physical explosions like Big Bangs and so on. And that, I think, is a profoundly erroneous conception of the origin of man, because the origin of man, if man possesses a spiritual, rational soul and the nature of a person, then the only sufficient cause of man can be a divine spirit and creator and omnipotent being who creates the soul from nothing. And in each man, even the parental genetic information given in conception or in generation of a new child can never explain that indivisible, free, rational, spiritual being of their child. So I think not just evolution cannot explain the new person, but also parents cannot explain the new person, because the new person requires this spiritual, rational soul that can only be created by a cause completely distinct from nature, because no biological processes could give rise to freedom in their product. So I think it's one of the most fantastic effects of creation, to create a being that is wholly created and dependent on another cause, and yet free. And no cell, not even an archangel, could create a free child.
What is life?
Well, when you think that life is the product of evolution and of some Big Bang that gives rise from non-living material substances to living organisms, then I think you fail to see the essential difference and newness of life, which expresses itself in such faculties as nutrition and metabolism, in growth, in propagation and in generation of new individuals of the same species, in the regeneration of missing, of wounded parts, and so on. And if you look at those wonders of living things, which we take for granted, but which we should be amazed by, then I think we see that all the laws of physics can never explain them. On the contrary, like Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize winner, said, in life we find not the laws of entropy, one of the fundamental laws of physics, the second law of entropy, the transformation into lower and lower forms of energy until warmth energy, but we find the opposite. We find negentropy. We find the building of new complexities and orders from more primitive stages of the living organism. And therefore life requires a completely new principle that accounts for these miracles of life. And of course the animal life requires even more, something like an animal soul, a sensitive soul, as Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas called it, that accounts for instincts, for memory, for perceptions, for pain, for suffering, for pleasure, and so on. And then when we come to the rational human life, then I think it requires a completely new principle again, namely a rational, spiritual human soul.
Evolution, abortion, and euthanasia.
Well, of course, if you look at the consequences of an atheistic and materialistic evolutionism for such questions as abortion or euthanasia, I think also of brain death, which is a notion I personally critically reject, the identification of the irreversible dysfunctionality of the brain with death. But of course then it has very many consequences also for ethics and for law, because to conceive of the embryo as a person, or to understand the embryo, the unborn human being, as a person whom we must not kill in abortion, requires that we do not reduce human personhood to an epiphenomenon or to a product of a later evolution of the cells. So I think if we have no notion of the person primarily being constituted by the soul and by the spiritual being that may awaken but exists already when it's still asleep and dormant like in the embryo, then it's very difficult to defend the dignity of that first conceived child. So I think with the materialistic evolutionist conception of man, you are very easily drawn to defend abortion or to defend euthanasia and to deny the personhood of man, of those people in whose life we cannot see the signs of their personhood and rationality, because there is no concept of soul, there's no concept really of person. Man is in some way a product of biological developments, and therefore before these develop to a certain stage there is no person, and after they dysfunction in the aging or in the comatose, there is no person either. So you can, so to speak, eliminate those human beings which are not persons, and therefore I think the philosophy of man and the understanding that the human being cannot be reduced to the brain nor to a product of evolution is decisive as foundation of rejecting such actions as abortion or euthanasia.
What about the problem of evil in the world?
Well, to this question of how can all the real or apparent evils in nature, cruelties, killer instincts, fleeing instincts, sufferings of animals, coexist with the goodness of God as creator? Is it not much rather a mirror of such a mindless and ultimately evil power struggle as perhaps the evolutionists assume as origin of living things, rather than the plan of a good and infinitely kind God? Well, this question is of course only part of a much bigger question, because a much greater problem for theodicy, that is for the defense of a good creator in view of evils in the world, relates to human history, all the innocent children that suffer, all the wars and destruction and killings and death and diseases and so on, of which the earth is full. So how can all of that coexist with a good creator? And I would say maybe there are different answers. One is that are given by Leibniz and other thinkers, that if you looked at the whole, you would see a very different view than if you just look at isolated parts of the whole. So, for example, in nature there is of course a certain wisdom in the ecology of the whole of nature, and if you look just at this particular animal that eats that animal, it looks simply awful. But if you look maybe at the whole equilibrium of ecology, it looks much better. To me that is not a very sufficient answer, because I think there remain cruelties and sufferings which, to my mind, are not reflections of a paradisic divine idea. Another answer is that the evils in the world of suffering are preceded by much greater evils in the universe, which comes from the abuse of the free will. And whereas when we look at all the cruelties and sufferings in nature or in human history, we are tending to accuse God of being so silent, so cruel, and letting all of that happen. But there is a much greater evil than the sufferings, and that is moral evil, sin, the revolt against God. So that evil, you could say, is theocentric. It doesn't ask us, let us ask, why is God so cruel, but rather, why is God so patient? Why does he allow that a creature that he created from nothing can offend him, insult him, sin against him, and so on? So when we look at the moral evil and religious evil of sin that directs itself directly against the holiness and goodness of God, and if we then consider that that evil both brings with it many evil consequences and sufferings which are self-inflicted by evil wills, like in the history of mankind, and also brings with them evils of suffering that are due and deserved as punishments and as sufferings because of this moral evil, then we have quite another perspective. You see, so to speak, not the isolated sufferings and cruelties, but first of all this abuse of the free will of both angels and humans that then have all kinds of sufferings as consequence, partly by bringing them about and partly by deserving them as punishment. And we may also say that there's of course a power of evil will, and we are somehow grateful to God, says C.S. Lewis, that he doesn't always take away our power whenever we want to commit a sin. We would be like marionettes whom he always controls by force. So giving us free will, I think God takes a certain risk, a big risk, that these free wills of creatures are abused. And so from that point of view, I think, the great value that is only possible through the good of the will justifies perhaps fully all the evils and sufferings which come from the abuse of the free will. Because if we had no free will, also the highest goods, like moral goods, religious values, adoration of God, glorification of God, sainthood, none of that would be possible. So one could say, well, maybe with the finality of these great goods, even the abuse of free will was taken into account, was accepted somehow as the price of giving free will to creatures. Of course, then you could ask whether even nature is in some way has an echo of free will, because you could, I mean, if you believe in the way in which the Bible presents the universe to us, then the demons, Lucifer is called the prince of this world, and angels are certainly somehow guardians of nature. And so if they become evil, it's very easily understandable that a great corruption compared to paradise takes place, that not the lion peacefully rests next to the lamb, but that they kill each other cruelly. And so there may be, if we believe both in the fall of man and in the sin of man and the first man and in the sin of the angels before that, then there may be a profound shock wave, as it were, over all nature that in some way resulted from that primary evil of moral evil. And we, of course, have no empirical way of verifying that. But in my opinion, the paradisic creation was much nicer than what we now are surrounded by. And I think we must assume that somehow, not only in human life and history, and diseases and all negative states, but also in the whole of nature, some consequence of these original evils affected nature. And that would be my answer to this difficult question.
Do you believe God used evolution?
Well, maybe if you assume that God is necessarily the cause of all beings in the world, of all contingent, finite, temporal things in the world, as I think you can prove philosophically, then you could still assume that God, as it were, uses the method of evolution as a method of creating the world. Instead of creating lions and tigers and cows, he creates the first one-celled animal, and then in the genetic code, he gives the potential to grow into all the different species of plants and animals. Then I think, well, you could understand different things. First of all, you could understand that he uses here chance and nature and explosions and millions of years of, so to speak, mistaken products that by chance never form even one single molecule, because I think there is an improbability of 1 to the hundreds or thousands of power that from accident even one single molecule of a living organism would form by chance. So let's say if he used chance as such a principle, I think this would be an absurdity. First of all, because an intelligent creator doesn't use such silly principles, and secondly, it would create billions of mistaken molecules, billions of monstrous animals or even no animals, and bones and chaos, and then there would be one meaningful form. So I think if you look at nature, none of that we find. We find in extremely regular and well-constructed nature where maybe exceptionally some monstrous formation takes place, but not at all as a rule. So certainly he didn't use that method. Now if he used the method, the creator used the method of, so to speak, programming these cells that they give rise to new species and to new species, but according to this intelligent plan, then we have already something else than actually evolution. But even then I think we would have to find all these transitional species from which the others grew, because they cannot jump from a giraffe to an elephant. So you would have to find, so to speak, all the intermediate stages between the giraffe and the elephant. And I don't think in the paleontology and history of life on the Earth you find anything that indicates that. You find some, like between wolves and hyenas and dogs, some intermediate similar creatures, but that none of that is in any way a proof of evolution. So I think the facts of science do in no way confirm such a universal hypothesis as Darwin introduced. And he even went so far as to say that if one single link was missing between two species, his whole theory would collapse. So he assumed like a continuous line where all the intermediate phases are covered by, and I think that's in no way the fact. And some interesting new findings of biologists working with mathematicians and with technological scientists found something very interesting, that even between two species that morphologically could easily be explained by evolution because they almost look like the same, we find, for example, between these different species of bacteria totally different technological systems of movement. For example, the one has an ingenious system of swimming that is totally different from the system of swimming of the neighboring and almost identical, morphologically almost identical other species of bacteria. And so you would not just have to explain how all these morphe, how all these forms of the animals proceed by evolution, but also how these totally different ideas and concepts of their motility, of their instruments of motion, how that could be explained by evolution. And for example, in this case, it can in no way be explained by evolution because it's like a totally different idea of an engineer who has two different systems of how things can move. And so I think there's no sign that, so to speak, would prove that God uses the evolution of all species as method of creation. And if he can create a seraphim, then he certainly can create a different species of animals. I mean, if we believe there is no omnipotent God, then of course we need to have some explosions or something to explain how they came about. But if everything is the work of an intelligent creator, I don't think we need such a poor idea as this evolution.